It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just like the ones we used to take when we were kids. Nothing special. A few friends, a few beers, a campfire under the stars. But looking back, I can tell you now it wasn't just a camping trip. It was a mistake. A mistake that's haunted me ever since. The plan was straightforward. A remote campsite about 2 hours north of the city. None of us had been there before, but we figured it would be a perfect spot for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and relaxation. I should have known something was off when we drove past a no camping sign on the way in, but we shrugged it off and continued. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The campsite was small, tucked in a hollow between two ridges. No other campers nearby, just the wind in the trees. It felt peaceful at first. We set up our tents, made a fire, and started telling stories. But as the sun set, the mood shifted. The forest, once welcoming, now felt like it was closing in on us. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches like skeletal hands. It felt wrong, but we brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the alcohol. Around midnight, someone suggested a night hike. We grabbed our flashlights and began walking down a dirt path that wound through the woods. The moon barely filtered through the trees. The silence was strange, like the woods were holding their breath. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered. We stopped and listened. At first, nothing. But then, in the distance, we heard it. A low hum, almost like a murmur, coming from deeper in the woods. "What is that?" Mark asked. "Probably just animals," I said, but I didn't believe it. The sound wasn't right. It was deliberate, unnatural. We turned around and headed back to camp. But the further we went, the worse it felt. The silence grew heavier, suffocating. I could feel it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. Back at camp, the feeling lingered. No one said much, but we sat around the fire, scanning the trees, waiting. At around 3 a.m., I crawled into my tent, hoping to sleep off the unease. But sleep didn't come. I kept hearing things outside, footsteps, breathing. I couldn't tell. Every time I'd sit up to listen, it would stop. When I finally thought I'd drifted off, I heard it again. That hum, louder now, closer. And not just one voice, whispers, low guttural murmurs. The air felt thick with them. I unzipped the tent, poked my head out. The fire was reduced to glowing embers. The others were still asleep. I considered waking them, but something told me not to. Something told me to stay quiet. Then I saw it, a figure at the edge of the clearing. Tall, too tall. It stood still like it was waiting. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, afraid it would notice me. The figure stepped forward, just enough to be in the firelight. It wore a cloak, its face hidden. Its hands were long, thin, with fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its head tilted, almost in curiosity, and I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was watching us, listening to the whispers, to the hum, waiting for something. I backed away into the tent, my hands shaking. The murmuring voices grew louder, echoing around me, even inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The figure was gone. The fire had burned out. Only ash remained. I woke the others, panic rising in my chest. We needed to leave now. At first, they resisted, but when they saw the fear in my eyes, they agreed. We packed up in a hurry, didn't even grab everything. We just jumped in the car and sped off, heading back to the nearest town. We never returned to that campsite. I never told anyone the full story. Not until now. Maybe you'll think I was scared. Maybe it was the alcohol or the isolation. But I know what I saw, what I felt. And sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still hear that hum, that whisper. And I know whatever was out there, it's still waiting. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, nothing more than a simple camping trip with a few friends. We all needed a break from work and school. A few days in the woods, away from everything. The plan was simple. Head out to a remote campsite, pitch our tents, enjoy some hiking, and unwind. But what happened that weekend has stuck with me, and I can't shake the feeling that something else was out there with us. We picked a site we found online, one of those hidden gems deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a little worried when we drove past a no camping sign, but we were young and reckless, and the promise of solitude seemed too good to pass up. We arrived around late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The forest was dense, towering trees casting shadows across the ground. There was a small clearing where we set up camp, just a few tents and a fire pit. The kind of place where the world felt far away. Everything seemed perfect at first. We gathered firewood, cracked open beers, and started a campfire. As the fire crackled, we talked, joked, and reminisced about old times. But something shifted as the night wore on. The deeper the night grew, the more uncomfortable the forest felt. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above us. The sounds of the night, crickets, owls, rustling animals, disappeared, leaving an unsettling silence that pressed in around us. And then, just as the fire was beginning to die down, one of my friends, Kelly, stood up and said, "Let's go for a walk." It seemed harmless, just a quick stroll in the woods, a way to stretch our legs. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down a trail that wound through the trees. The further we walked, the quieter it got. It was like the woods were holding their breath, the usual nocturnal sounds silenced. We walked for about 20 minutes before Kelly stopped suddenly, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, faintly, a low sound came from deep in the woods. It was hard to describe, like a soft murmur or hum, almost as if someone was whispering just out of earshot. "What is that?" Dylan asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," I said, but even I could tell there was something wrong. None of us spoke as we turned around and began walking back to camp, but the eerie hum seemed to follow us. It wasn't getting louder, but it was always there, like a distant conversation we couldn't quite make out. We made it back to camp without incident, but the feeling of unease didn't leave. The fire had burned low, and we gathered around it, silently watching the embers flicker. The woods around us felt thick, as if the trees were pressing in on us. The air was heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. I crawled into my tent around 2 a.m., hoping sleep would clear my head. But sleep didn't come. I tossed and turned, hearing things, footsteps maybe, a slight rustle in the leaves. Each time I'd sit up and listen, everything would stop, leaving nothing but the sound of my own breathing. But every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, the low hum, far off, like it was always there just beyond my hearing. Then came the voices. I thought I was imagining it at first, but the more I listened, the more certain I was. Faint whispers, They seemed to be circling around the camp, moving from one side to the other. The murmurs weren't English or any language I recognized. It was like a low chant, repetitive and rhythmic, and it made my skin crawl. I couldn't stand it anymore. I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fire was down to glowing embers now, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. And that's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it stood motionless in the shadow of the trees. Its outline was blurry, like it wasn't entirely real, but it was there watching us. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes, like they were burning into me. I held my breath, not daring to move. The figure didn't approach, but I didn't want to wait around to see what would happen. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the inside of the tent, listening to the whispers growing louder. Finally, around 5 a.m., I decided we had to leave. I couldn't stay another minute. I woke my friends, told them we were packing up. At first, they laughed, thinking I was overreacting, but when they saw the panic in my eyes, they agreed. We packed everything as quickly as we could, barely speaking. We left the campsite behind, not even bothering to grab everything, just our essentials and whatever we could carry. As we made our way back to the cars, the hum and whispers faded, but that feeling of being watched never left. We didn't talk about it much on the drive back, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something following us. I never went back to that campsite. None of us did. But sometimes when I'm out in the woods, especially alone, I still hear that hum, those whispers. And every time, I remember that thing in the shadows watching us.